Today I will be showing you how to pin a small moth. This is a beautiful specimen that I collected last night, and I'm going to pin it today so it doesn't get a chance to dry out, which will happen if I wait too long. It's much easier to pin out a fresh specimen because the wings are still nice and mobile. I caught it in a collection tub and euthanized it by putting it in the freezer. This brings me no joy, but unfortunately it's part of the process, and the specimens I prepare are going into a scientific collection. Onward. Note that throughout this process I touch the moth as little as possible and I don't touch it with my hands. This is because touching it makes some of the scales on the wings come off and the moth ends up looking worn. So the first step of preparing the specimen is to put a pin through the thorax. In order to do this, you'll need to pick up the moth with forceps. If you're watching this video, I assume you don't have professional mothing gear, so I suggest that you get all your household tweezers and see what works. Certain tweezers might work well for a moth with a large, round thorax, and others might work better for a moth with a smaller thorax. So play around with it and see what works. So get a pin. This is a proper mothing pin, but I will use a simple metal-headed pin because this is what I'm used to using. If you're going to want to keep your specimens long term, I suggest you use a stainless steel pin because it won't rust. Now, you're going to want to lay the moth upside down because it's easier to pick up. And you pick a pair of tweezers and you'll grab either side of the thorax. You might find this will take a few tries and you might need to swap tweezers to find a pair that you can get a good grip with. And it can cause a bit of wear if you pick up and drop the specimen, but that's normal initially. So hold it quite tightly, and you'll need to in order to keep it steady while sticking the pin in. Next, so you'll pick up the moth and you'll flip it so you have access to the top side of it, which is the side you'll be pinning into. I like to hold the tweezers in my dominant hand and the pin in my non-dominant hand. That might not work for everyone though, so try and see what works for you. And I don't have the steadiest hand, so I'll brace my left hand against my right hand before I attempt to insert the pin. Now I'm aiming to get the pin in the middle of the thorax from side to side and slightly above the middle long ways. In terms of the angle, you want the pin to be as close as perpendicular as you can get it, so both long ways and from side to side. So no matter what way you hold the moth, the pin it is at a 90-degree angle. Hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate this for you now. So I'll pick a pair of tweezers, get my pin, pick up the moth, brace it, get a good grip on the pin, and insert the pin through the thorax. There you go. That's pretty good. See how it is perpendicular to the moth from the front and from side to side, roughly anyway. I've stuck the pin in far enough that it won't slip off the moth, but now I will push the moth further onto the pin using tweezers. You want to put the tweezers underneath the moth long ways, like this, with half on either side of the pin. Keep the tweezers flat so you don't skewer the moth with the tips. I've also found that when I've tried to slide a small moth up the pin with the tweezers sideways like this, I've taken the head off the moth, which isn't what we're trying to do and is a little disturbing. So tweezers long ways works better. So grasp the top of the pin with your fingertips and gently slide the moth up the pin until there's 1 to 2 centimeters between the top of the pin and the top of the moth. Oops. So like that. That's pretty good. Next you want to mount it onto your moth pinning board. This is what a professional moth pinning board looks like. It's made of balsa and plywood. And this is the one I have made and I'm going to use today. It's made of leftover core flute, polystyrene and tracing paper. And I found it very easy to use. Now let me know in the comments if you want a tutorial showing how I made it. Now I'm going to stick the pin into the groove so that the moth is flat from side to side and lengthways. Like this, I will show you. So it's flat from side to side and flat lengthways. If the moth isn't perfectly perpendicular on the pin, you will need to insert the pin at an angle to compensate, because it's really important that the moth's body is straight at this point. I'll need to readjust the pin. Since this is quite a large-bodied moth, I'll need to put pins beside the abdomen so that the moth doesn't rotate on the pin when I try to spread the wings. And you can use any pin you like for this step, because they won't be attached to the final specimen. So I'm going to put them reasonably high up the abdomen so that they don't crush it, and close enough to hold the moth, but not so close that they squash the moth. So I'll show that to you now. Gently slide it underneath the wing and push it down. The other side, gently slide it in and push it down. You can see it's holding the moth on either side. Next, you'll need to take 2 narrow strips of paper. The ideal paper is this roll of moth pinning paper, but you can also just cut strips of tracing paper, and baking paper would probably work too. Just a paper that is slightly translucent and isn't too rough or too grippy. Next, you're going to want to pin the 2 strips of paper onto the board like this, right next to the groove. One on either side. Like so. And a moth has 2 pairs of wings, the forewings and the hind wings. And I'm going to spread the forewing on one side first, and there are a number of ways I could do this. I could grasp the front of the wing with the tweezers and gently slide it upwards. I could use the tweezers or a pin to push the wing open by applying pressure to a vein, or I can use an acupuncture pin by stabbing it through the abdomen of the wing then lifting. Or the way I like to do it is to use a pair of closed tweezers and push the wing open from the bottom. I find I tend to rip the wings if I try a grabbing technique, but you might find that one of those methods works well for you. If you are choosing to pull the wing open from the front, it's important that you apply pressure only to the veins of the wing, and you'll see what I mean when you look at your specimen. Because if you apply pressure to the areas between the veins, it's very easy to rip the wing. Now I'm going to go ahead and push the wing up, and once it's in a position I like, I'll apply gentle pressure to the paper and pin on either side of the wing. So I'll show you that now. Gently lift the wing up onto the board. And then I'm going to apply pressure from the underneath. Gentle pressure. Slide the wing up. And once it's in a position I like, I'm going to gently press down from the top and put a pin on either side of the wing. Like this. The hind wing is a little trickier because it has less veining than the forewing and is therefore more fragile. So I'll use the same method, but I'll just be slightly more gentle. So push the hind wing up, hold the top edge down, release the bottom edge, and pin underneath. So you can see it looks like that now. Now I'm going to repeat the same process on the other side, and then I'll show you the geometry. Gently lift the wing up onto the side of the board. Push it up from the underneath. Once it's in a good position, press down gently. Put a pin on either side of the wing. And the hind wing on this side too. Like this. Now I forgot to mention earlier that you want the moth's body to be flat with the top side of the pinning board. That's just so that when you pin the wings they look like they're flat, not like they're raised or lowered. So that's where I'm at currently. So the main rule of thumb for the geometry is that you want the line at the back of the forewings to be a straight line. So you can see the 2 pairs of wings, and you can see that there's a roughly straight line across the back of the forewings. And for the hind wings, you just want a small gap between them and the forewing, and you want the gap to be roughly the same on both sides. You may wish to vary the wing layout for some species of moth if you feel that the standard shape is inadequate for displaying the entirety of the wings. Now, if the moth's wings are sticking quite far out on either side of the paper, you can choose to get a little extra bit of paper and pin the tips of the wings down. This is so that when the moth dries, the tips of the wings don't curl up. I'm not going to do it for this specimen because the wings are quite small and I don't think the tips will curl. Next, I like to remove the pins holding the abdomen in place because I find that if I leave them, it can cause a bit of a kink in the body of the moth, and I'm going to move them to create a V shape underneath the end of the abdomen of the moth, like this. It's going to be a little fiddly. Like this. So it's just offering the end of the abdomen a bit of support so that it doesn't sag when the moth dries. It's also good practice to pin up the antennae. Not everyone does it, but it is good practice. So you'll want to gently hook the antennae out from underneath the moth. This one's antennae are already dried quite tight to its body, so I'm not going to be able to pin them nicely. But you would put a pin on either side of the antennae. It will curl when it dries. That's okay, but if you want the antennae to dry in a nice straight line, you'll want to use a piece of paper to pin down from the top of the moth. Some people pin the front legs up too. Can be good practice, but it's not mandatory. And now it's finished. So you want to leave the specimen to set in a warm, dry place for at least 2 days. Sometimes I leave mine drying for up to 5 days. If you remove them too early, it can cause the wings to sag because they might not be completely dry. And once the specimen is dry, you can carefully remove all of the pins except for the metal one through the thorax and remove the paper, and you'll end up with something looking like this. There you go. If you wish to preserve the specimen long term, keep it in a dry container with silica for humidity control. And that concludes the tutorial. If you like the video, please like the video if you found it helpful and leave a comment if you have any helpful tips and tricks that I missed. Thanks for watching!